good afternoon, morning, evening, everyone, whenever you find yourself viewing this final wrap-up session on our all-church read, How to Be an Anti-Racist with Kendi and Ibram. It has been such a beautiful ride with you. I am so elated to have taken this journey with you. We have traveled here and there and around the corner and far and wide. And I'm just excited to have had this moment with Reverend Dr. Velda Love and Reverend Dr. Sharon Finema of Join the Movement Towards Racial Justice. I'm so excited to work with them. I just don't want it to end. I don't want it to end. So I'm just pausing for a moment. There are no PowerPoints, there are no bells and whistles, because I just want to talk. I just want us to talk for a moment. Think about how far we have traveled. 18 miles. We have traveled with Kendi to explore the many types of racism that exist today. We have started in chapter 1 with definitions. We have gone all the way to dueling consciousness, to power, to biology, to ethnicity, to body, to culture, to behavior, to color, to white, to black, to class, to space, to gender, to sexuality, to failure, to success, and then finally to survival. That is how far we have covered the terrain. And Kendi has brought us to see how racist policies implemented by government officials, to racism within individuals and groups. He has helped us to consider and recognize racism, while at the same time seeking to teach us how to adopt an anti-racist mindset, which ultimately leads us to eradicating racist policies. And once that's done, in some ways, in that pursuit, we become anti-racist. So I have a question for you. 18 miles you have journeyed. Are you now an anti-racist? Now, I don't say that to be sarcastic. I say that for you to think about the journey you've taken, why you've taken that journey, and where you're at the end of the journey, and how much more work do you need to do, and how much more work we need to do as a society. Because as Kendi paints this picture, and I know that in many ways I pushed back with Kendi, and sometimes I agreed with Kendi, and sometimes I was kind of like, this is a little kumbaya. But as I settled in, a point he made stuck with me because it's where I struggle the most. He argues that racism in politics has created an inequality among races that could be so far ingrained in our society that efforts to see a reversal of these policies and ideas might be futile. And I must admit, as hopeful as I am, sometimes I tend to pause at this statement and in some ways agree with this statement. And I'm going to say it again. He argues that racism in politics has created an inequality among races that could be so far ingrained in our culture, in our society, that efforts to see a reversal of these policies and ideas might be futile. And I'm going to tell you why I struggle. I don't know if you struggle in the same way as you live the experience of being Black or white or Asian or Hispanic, however, whatever indigenous, however you identify yourself in these United States of America, the experiences you've had in the United States of America. Do you tend to agree with this statement, or do you see hope? And that's where we're going to kind of settle our souls in this wrap up. I tend to struggle in agreement with this statement because my work always takes me back to slavery and looking at how slavery is still ingrained in a part of the American mindset. And that mindset, in many ways, are built upon the idea and the notion that Black people are inferior and that Black people are only valued or valuable by what they produce. And in some ways, it seeks in its racist endeavor to render Black people inhumane or inhumanely. What do I mean? I am reminded when I read that last statement by Kendi, as he provides us all these tools to move towards being an anti-racist. I am reminded of how far ingrained racism is in American society through its policies and ideas. Just by a story with our first president of the United States, the general of the U.S. Army that fought against the American Revolution, President and General George Washington. Washington owned over 300 Black bodies. And those 300 Black bodies played a major role in building Mount Vernon and George Washington's and his family's legacy capital. And I'm talking about monetary capital. So what do I mean here? I'm reminded of a story of a woman named Lucy. You see, George Washington, we know who was a part of his enslaved family by way of a diary he kept. He used to write their names down, their age, and then next to their age, he'd put a little notation about them. And I'm reminded in this statement that racism is so far ingrained that efforts to reverse it, policy and ideas might seem futile. I'm reminded of Lucy. Lucy was 55 years old when George Washington wrote this notation in his diary about Lucy. He says, lazy and lame, or pretends to be so due to onset or bouts of arthritis. But he employed her as a knitter. And she worked as a knitter with George Washington most of her childhood, teenage, and adult life. Here it is, a Black woman who contributed to the building of this great nation, who contributed to the building of George Washington's Mount Vernon, who contributed to the livelihood of George Washington's family. And the notation of her contribution at 55 years old is that she is lazy and lame. This is the reality that we have to contend with that is so far ingrained, not only in policies and ideas, but in the souls of many Americans. Kendi tells us in this final chapter that the source of racist ideas was not or is not ignorance and hate, but self-interest. I'll say it again. Kendi tells us in his final chapter on survival that the source of racist ideas is not ignorance and hate, but self-interest. That is a powerful statement because as George Washington and so many others use Black people towards their own self-interest and discarded them after the use of their mind, bodies, and soul, classified them still as inferior after they built out of trauma this great nation, after they contributed to the building of this great nation. They get labeled as lazy and lame, all for the self-interest of those that benefit from the commodities they produce. Kendi says the history of racist ideas is the history of powerful policymakers erecting racist policies out of self-interest. There's no greater person that fits this bill than General President George Washington. I'll say it a different way because then it sounds like I'm saying General President as a title. General George Washington, President George Washington, President of the United States of America, the first president, and the general who led us into victory during the American Revolution. So Kendi goes on to say that the history of racist ideas is a history of powerful policy making, erecting racist policies out of self-interest, then producing racist ideas to defend and rationalize the inequitable efforts of their policies, while everyday people consume those racist ideas, which turn into sparks of ignorance and hate. So he tells us that to treat the ignorance and hate and expecting racism to go away is not the answer. It's not the answer. It's like cancer, right? He says the body politic might feel better momentarily in dealing with the symptoms, but it won't last long because they have not dealt with the cause. And as long as the underlying cause remains, just like cancer, the tumor is going to grow, racism is going to grow, and the symptoms will just keep returning. Dealing with the symptom, ignorance and race, is a suicidal strategy. We must deal with the underlying cause, which is self-interest. How does racism serve our individual and collective self-interest? How are the policies created to protect the self-interest of one group versus others? That becomes my question. Kendi said he started asking himself these very questions. What am I doing to change policy? What am I doing to change policy? And how can I genuinely urge people to focus on changing policy if I'm not focused on changing policy? In essence, what he seeks, he himself must engage in doing. Kendi says, because racism is a cancer, we must be intentional about staring inside the body of our nation's racial inequities, racial inequalities, inequities in our neighborhoods, in our occupations, in our institutions, and call it out and work to eradicate racist policies. But we cannot work towards this aim if we don't even believe it exists. We also cannot treat this cancer if we believe that all is lost. So when I started and I said that racism is so far ingrained in our society that the idea to eradicate it through policies is futile, is a myth. I have to come back to that statement as a person of faith and say that the pathway to move away from what I believe to be impossible sometimes, especially when I look at people like Lucy, who worked 55 years for the self-interest of George Washington and end up being notated in American history as lame and lazy because she has arthritis. She a good knitter though. She knits quite well, but she lame and lazy because she got bouts of arthritis. Now, when I think about that, when I really think about that, it's hard for me to move to the place of possibility. But as a person of faith, I'm inclined to think that all hope is not lost. Even though racism lives not just in our policies and our ideas, but also in our soul, I'm a bit hopeful. I believe as Kendi has moved us to and pushed us towards to believe in the possibility that we can strive, and he says directly, to be an anti-racist, that we can transform our societies to be anti-racist. Because racist power is not godly, he says, and racist policies are not indestructible. Racial inequities are not inevitable. And here's the crescendo. Racist ideas are not natural to the human mind. And I'm going to drop my anchor here. I'm going to literally drop my anchor here. And I'm going to believe that the notation of Black and brown bodies that experience the inequities in American society will move from policies that deem them to be inferior, lame, and lazy, that deem them to be only useful by the commodities they produce, that only are existing at the self-interest of others. I'm going to believe that as a people of faith, coming together, that we can work towards eradicating racist policies. And one of the ways to do that is not just changing our mindset, but voting. That's where I'm going to drop my anchor as I wrap up, as we come towards a new age in American democratic society. A new age, a new opportunity in 2024 to vote against racist policies as anti-racist people of faith. Reverend Dr. Velda Love uses this term all the time, Ubuntu. I am because you are. And it's a well-known phrase in South Africa, as you know, because she talks about it all the time. And it speaks about the country's moral ideas, the spirit of togetherness, and our ability to work together. It essentially means I am because we are. So the question is, at the end of this journey, I am racist because you are racist. Or we take the path of, I am anti-racist because you are anti-racist. You are anti-racist because I am anti-racist. We are all connected. And we can grow in this endeavor. And we can progress in growth in this endeavor by being honest and not in denial about how racism functions in this society to create inequities and inequalities against certain types of people and functions even in oppressed groups against certain types of people. And that when we are anti-racist, when we are committed to anti-racist behavior and the eradication of anti-racist policies, we have been committed to a beloved endeavor. And we are committed to moving this nation forward with intentionality towards a world where everyone is seen as human and everyone has a role to play and the right to equality. Join the movement towards racial justice. It has been a beautiful journey to take with each of you, and I am grateful for this moment. I am grateful to have traveled this terrain, and I hope there are many more opportunities to travel with you as you work each day to see yourself and to see the world as it is and to move it to where it's intended to be. Have a great day, everyone.